Well, it's all kicking off in America, where the man who wants to be president again is now a convicted felon.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace.
Back in the UK, no criminals standing here as far as we know, but still a massive election week. We'll be asking who is up and who is down 1 week in.
And we'll have new evidence of what the voters really think about July the 4th.
And the TikTok campaign and us in tank tops.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Kamal Ahmed.
Are you ready? I'm absolutely ready. I've been ready. I'm hoping with all of my heart that they call me.
Trump's lawyers called Daniel's testimony pure embarrassment.
We've been waiting to hear from Donald Trump, but that a verdict has been reached.
Donald Trump has been found guilty on count 1. Donald Trump, the first former president to be convicted in a criminal trial.
Guilty. Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. All 34 are felonies.
Only in America, Camilla, a living and breathing Netflix series. There's some of the responses to Donald J. Trump being convicted in a New York court of 34 counts of falsifying business records to cover up a payment he made to Stormy Daniels, an adult film star, to buy her silence over an alleged affair. So now a convicted felon, obviously the Republican candidate to be the next president of the United States. I think the first thing we asked when this happened, can someone who is a convicted felon stand to be president? And apparently the founding fathers didn't really think about this when they set up the Constitution. And so the answer is yes. There are actually only 3 rules about standing to be the president of the United States. Firstly, you have to be a natural-born citizen of the United States, be at least 35 years old, and have been resident of the United States for 14 years.
So the big question now, Kamal, is whether he'll go to prison. It seems unlikely, doesn't it? Because he's quite old now, and it's a first offence. And there is a debate to be had about the kind of arcane nature of what it is he's accused of and been found guilty of, and whether that actually merits a custodial sentence. The sentencing is due on July the 11th, but he's saying, of course he is, that he's going to appeal. That sort of drags it out somewhat, and maybe if he does appeal, that takes the legal case beyond the timing of the election. But he could still theoretically stand and be president from prison.
America is really quite unusual. There was a candidate in 1920 called Eugene V. Debs, not a household name in the UK, but he actually stood from prison in the 1920 presidential election and received 3.4% of the votes. The reason he was in prison was because he campaigned against the American involvement in the First World War. So when you first hear this, you think, well, that must be it for Trump in terms of actual practicalities of standing in a presidential campaign. But, as we say, there are very few rules. He can stand even from prison.
Bizarre in extremis, although that's probably the word to use to describe the trial. Our Telegraph colleague Susie Coen joins us from New York. Susie, you were in court for this entire show trial, and you described the court case as veering from the implausible to the obscene. I mean, tell us, what was it like inside the courtroom, seeing Trump on the stand, and then, of course, for the guilty verdict?
Well, the guilty verdict, I've never known tension like it. Not only were we being read such a damning verdict by the foreman of the jury who was standing delivering the verdict, the Wi-Fi cut out, so journalists were also panicking. And then we had Trump at the front of the room, completely motionless, staring straight ahead. Usually, there's a bit of movement there. He might speak to someone or at least rearrange himself. But, this was a man who was completely stony face, staring forward. And it was really, I can't even describe how tense it was in the room.
But do you mean stony faced as opposed to angry? Because I was looking at the footage overnight and thinking to myself, oh my goodness, the red mist hasn't descended. It's orange mist. It's Trump mist. I mean, he is deep down absolutely fuming, isn't he?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, as he turned to leave the courtroom, he walked past us. I was sitting in the aisle on the second row, so I was inches away from him. His face was so red, the fury in his eyes. He grabbed his son Eric's hand, very, really grasped it. This was a man who was, yeah, furious, and yeah, you could feel it. It was palpable.
And Susie, it's amazing that you were just a few metres away from him when all this was happening. What a moment of history to be involved in. We often see Trump, don't we, sort of packaged. He performs when he's in public. There's a media figure. But my sense is that you actually did get, I think fury is there as well, but also shock that it has that the trial has gone in the way it's gone and that all the 34 charges he was found guilty.
Yes, definitely. And I think that the way that the verdict was delivered, just moments before, the judge had said, I'm going to send the jury home at 4:30. So everyone breathed a big sigh of relief, including Trump. We're going home. They're nowhere near, because we were waiting to see whether they might have asked for a bit longer to continue deliberations that evening. Then you might expect a verdict. Then it gets to 4:30, and then 5 minutes later, and we still haven't seen the jury. And then the judge comes back in and says, we've got a verdict. They want 30 minutes. So it's gone from this moment of, calm, at ease. Everyone's thinking about what they might have for dinner. Donald Trump probably thinking about McDonald's or a Diet Coke. And then suddenly this tension, this out of nowhere, a man who is always in control had that control completely ripped from him.
And Susie, for those who haven't followed the case in great detail, two big other characters alongside, obviously, Donald Trump himself. One is Stormy Daniels and the other is Michael Cohen. Could you just give us a little thumbnail of Stormy Daniels, what it was like watching her during the trial, and then also who is Michael Cohen?
So Stormy Daniels, we all knew it was going to be a very interesting day, let's put it that way, but nobody was prepared for quite how extreme and salacious her testimony was going to be. She was very relaxed on the stand, building up a rapport with the jury, talking directly to them, a bit nervous at first, but soon relaxed into it, as if she was speaking to a group of old school friends about maybe a Tinder date that had gone wrong. But her testimony was, I'd say, the crescendo of the trial, even though it wasn't relevant to the case in the sense that it had nothing to do with the falsifying documents, but the prosecution argued that it was necessary to show why he wanted to silence her.
Susie, we know you've got to get back to business. We look forward to reading all of your work on this on the Telegraph website and in the paper. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Susie. Have a great rest of your day in New York.
As luck would have it, our US editor, Tony Diver, is in the studio. Why are you in London, Tony, when you're normally based in Washington?
I am. I'm normally in DC. I had a very ill-timed holiday, which has now turned into working. But it also means that I get to come and see you and be on this fantastic podcast.
I've got to say, it's good to see you in the flesh. I don't know if you know this, Kamal, but Tony, this wonderful specimen, this up-and-coming journalist who is now got a big role in America, was once my mentee.
Oh, that's
I
brilliant.
taught this lad
he owes
everything he knows.
He owes you everything.
No, I'm joking.
Absolutely
He's
right.
done it all on his own
Tony,
back.
you can share over a cup of tea after we finish this podcast what it was really like being mentored by the unbelievably brilliant Camilla Tominey. But Tony, let's kick off with those broader ramifications. Susie's taken us through the actual case itself. In terms of, let's start with polling. What do you think the effect will be for Donald Trump and his push for the White House of the fact that he's now a convicted felon?
Well, this is a slightly counterintuitive one, and I should start by saying that when you poll people about things that haven't yet happened, the answers aren't always that reliable. But actually, the polling that we've done ourselves, the Telegraph has conducted some polling in the swing states, and we found that Donald Trump's ratings actually improve if he was to be convicted. And that's because you have some people who understandably think that they wouldn't want to put a convicted felon into the White House, but there's also a fair number of people who buy into this argument by the Trump campaign that this is a politically motivated prosecution, that this is being run behind the scenes by the Biden administration. They see Trump as the underdog, and they therefore support him even more. And actually, we find that those people tend to outweigh those who are put off by the conviction. And we'll have to see what happens in the data. And I expect there'll be polls being conducted right now across America as people scramble to find out what the result of all of this is. But I think we will probably see a boost for Trump's ratings in some of these places.
Let's just get into that swing states issue. For people who don't follow American politics too closely, there are 6, possibly 7 states where the election will actually be decided: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona and Nevada. And some people add North Carolina to that. There's analysis that says it's only 6% of voters that actually will decide who wins in November. And so even though the movement in response to the convictions may be small, it could still be super, super significant.
That's right. You hear people on the both Trump and Biden campaigns talking about this, the 6% of 6. And it's 6% of voters within those 6 states.
It's like 300,000 voters or something. It's tiny.
Yeah, exactly. You think about that. That's what, I don't know, five Wembley stadiums or something like that. We're talking in a country of 350 million people. This is a very small number. And so both campaigns are hyper-focused on those very small margins and the possibility of small improvements. So something like this, if it does manage to swing the dial, I think could be very significant. I mean, in a place like Georgia, it's a state that Biden won in 2020 by only 0.02% of the vote. But it is a winner-takes-all election, and so if you win the state, you get all of the delegates. This is not about the raw number of people in America who vote for either candidate. This is about which way the states go, and something like this does have the potential to move the dial.
Tony, how does Biden respond to this? Because the Democrats are meant to stand for fairness. Ron DeSantis has tweeted in response to this conviction. He's the Republican governor of Florida. He did try and run against Trump to become the nominee, didn't get enough support. This is quite an interesting, reasoned and nuanced response. He's basically saying it's often said that no one is above the law, but it is also true that no one is below the law. If the defendant were not Donald Trump, this case would never have been brought, the judge would never have issued similar rulings, and the jury would never have returned a guilty verdict. Now, that argument is going to play quite well with some people. I appreciate the MAGA, the Make America Great Again campaigners are always going to be on the side of Trump. But aren't there some people who very much value judicial fairness and the rule of law, right-minded Republicans and Democrats who are going to be concerned about this?
Yes, I think there are a lot of those people. And I think there are some merits to these arguments, which is if you look at the actual crimes that he's been convicted of, they're not normally felonies. These business records convictions that Trump has got are usually misdemeanors in New York, but they have been upgraded to be a category felony in this case. And there are people that say that's politically motivated. The prosecutors were and the judge were going after Trump from the beginning. And it's obviously true that the only reason why we care about all of this is because the Stormy Daniels story was going to come out in advance of the 2016 election in which Donald Trump was running and he didn't want to hurt his chances. So none of the sort of architecture around this case would exist if Donald Trump wasn't Donald Trump. There's no way that a prosecutor would be spending all of this money going after, to such an extent, someone who had falsified business records in something completely pointless or unrelated to the wider public. So I think there is an element of truth to that, and I think that argument does hold some water. Now, does it hold water to the extent that the Trump campaign pushes it, which is to say this is a complete witch hunt and this is all being secretly orchestrated behind the scenes of the White House? No, probably not, but I think that there is an element of truth to that.
And the Biden response?
Well, what we've seen so far is Biden say very little about it. We had one tweet last night, just a couple of lines, saying that no one should be above the law and that this was a good reason, this conviction was a good reason to vote Democrat and to donate money to his campaign. What we haven't actually seen is any response from the White House, because, of course, we have to remember that Biden is both head of his own campaign and he's also the president and has the whole infrastructure of the US government behind him. The White House counsel's office, the lawyers in the White House have issued no comment in response to this, and I don't expect we will see much response from the White House. There's a few reasons for that. One, it's that you perhaps don't want to get drawn into this back and forth over whether or not the prosecution was legitimate in the first place. And secondly, it's that, as we see here, it's all over the front pages already. Trump being guilty can't really be a better story for Biden than it already is. So why would you intervene
don't
when your opponent...
Don't disturb the enemy when they're making a mistake.
Exactly.
Just to your point, Camilla, or Ron DeSantis' point, in America, of course, justice is much more political because much more of the justice system is actually voted on. You are voted in to be the Attorney General. So the prosecuting authorities are much more influenced by politics than they ever would be in the UK. So for UK listeners listening to this, they might say, oh, yes, but, justice is outside, politics. But in America, it's much more intertwined. If we go back to those swing states and what the effect might be in the run-in to the election. At the moment, Trump, I think, is actually, in the most recent polling, is actually ahead in 4 of those swing states. And at the moment, most of the polling is guiding towards a very tight Trump victory. Why has Biden found it so difficult to use? This is only one of a myriad of cases against Donald Trump. Donald Trump has changed the way we think about what is a candidate anymore. Things that would have sunk many, many previous candidates have been actually sometimes good news for Donald Trump. Why has Biden been so weak in getting the Democrats to have more positive response amongst voters?
Well, I think what we saw about 3 or 4 months ago is a huge shift in the way that Biden was tackling this election. Previously, last year, he liked to talk about Bidenomics. That was his big thing. It's domestic economic policy. It's the Inflation Reduction Act. It's putting money into production of electric vehicles, semiconductor chips, all these kind of purely economic domestic issues. He stopped doing that now. He does talk about it now and then. But really what he now campaigns on is the threat to democracy from Donald Trump. And I think if this polling is right, and if we find that Donald Trump wins in November, the sort of Democrat post-mortem will say that shift came far too late. And that if you are the Biden campaign, then making arguments about the wider threats to democracy, pointing out the fact that Donald Trump was involved in the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, that he has consistently said that he hasn't said that he would necessarily accept the result if he lost again. His supporters have done the same thing. Those sorts of arguments about the threats to the American political system is the sort of thing Biden is saying now, but there are some strategists who say, well, it's too little too late. And actually, those Trump arguments about the politicization of the judiciary and the Biden witch hunt have now taken root in a way in the minds of some of the 6% of voters in 6 states, which can't be undone now.
These other cases against him, Tony, so the retention of classified documents case and then the insurrection case, the Capitol riots case, when will they be heard? Well beyond the election?
It looks like it, yes. We were initially expecting to hear those before, but it now looks like they will be pushed back after the election. And that's significant because those 2 cases, the classified documents case and the Washington case, the January 6th case, are the only 2 federal prosecutions against Donald Trump. So both the Stormy Daniels case and another case in Georgia surrounding election interference are both state prosecutions. The reason why it matters that they're federal cases is because if he was elected president in November, he would have the ability to pardon himself in those cases. So pushing back the dates of those trials beyond the presidential election is very significant for him because he's basically in a position, he either becomes president of the United States or he goes to prison for the rest of his life. That's a very serious choice that he's facing.
And was I right earlier to suggest that if he does appeal, then it does drag it out to beyond November?
Possibly, we don't know. We don't know what the dates are. We don't know if an appeal will be accepted or if it was, how long it would take. Clearly, there is some impetus here, and Kamal, as you rightly point out, among Democrat prosecutors in particular, to try and get this stuff seen and heard before the election takes place. But we just don't know what the dates are. And so far, the Trump strategy of trying to push this stuff back as far as possible while making as much noise about it as possible has been quite successful.
Thanks so much, Tony. All eyes now on July the 11th, actually the date of the next NATO summit. So who will also be in America, as well as Tony Diver, of course, our US editor, will be whoever is the next Prime Minister of the UK. So what an exciting moment that will be for us all. And it's also 4 days ahead of the Republican convention, which is going to actually presumably anoint Donald Trump. But look, thanks so much, Tony. Safe journeys back to America.
Should we talk about, are we week 1 of the election? No, we're into week 2. We're on day 9.
Golly, it seems, yes.
Feels like week 9, doesn't it?
Genuinely, Camilla, I've no idea really what day it is because we've been very, very speedily working away every day.
We've been beavering. And I think I've just written my column for Saturday's paper. And obviously in the fashion of, as I'm described on X and other social media platforms, Tory stooge, Tory battle axe, Tory client journalist, I have written, true to type, that I actually think the Conservatives have had a very good week.
It started with Rishi Sunak's interview with us on the Tuesday. So obviously we had Bank Holiday Monday here. So Tuesday was the first big day back to campaigning. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners have listened to it. But you and I, Camilla, have been talking quite a bit about it. And we've actually done quite a few interviews about it to other outlets about did it show a different Sunak. And we both thought that it did. And it showed a human side to him that we hadn't really seen before. And also we've had this very rapid announcement of a set of policies that could be considered to be the retail offer from Rishi Sunak. And each of them on their own has polled pretty positively, particularly national service and the pensions quadruple lock. So the national service was this idea that at the age of 18, there'd be some form of compulsory national or civic service, either in the armed forces or doing weekend community volunteering work. That has polled pretty well, particularly for core Conservative voters. And the second one was that for pensioners on the state pension, they wouldn't be dragged any further into the tax system because of the problem that all of us with incomes are facing, which is this fiscal drag, which is the thresholds are not rising at the same pace of inflation. And so Rishi Sunak said pensions would be protected from that.
I just think that a few good things have been landed for the Tories. We've got some policy ideas and we're not afraid to tell you about them. Comparatively, I think the electorate's still confused as to what is going in this Labour manifesto. Jeremy Hunt was on the airwaves, the Chancellor, this week, basically saying that taxes would definitely come down. I mean, they have to. And he boxed the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, into a bit of a corner because she could only say that they wouldn't go up. I agree with you on finally we see the real Rishi, thanks to our podcast, which is obviously a bonus for him. Let's also talk about the slow destruction of reform. We saw polling this week. Savanta did some polling for The Telegraph, where we see that reform's popularity has dropped from 11 points to 9. I think that's directly on the back of Nigel Farage being forced into not standing as an MP because he said that Rishi Sunak's snap announcement hasn't given him enough time. We then saw Richard Tice trying to sell this migrant tax. I mean, he came on GB News last night and pretty quickly the whole policy unravelled. I had Sirocco Forte on the show with me as well. He employs lots of foreign workers because he runs 2 hotels, one in London, one in Edinburgh. He said this is a crazy idea. And Forte is somebody who has donated to the Tories but has been talking about voting for reform. I think he's now reconsidering that position. So meanwhile, Ed Davey, Kamal.
Now, Camilla, I want a promise from you that we are going to do the Lib Dems next week. So for all our many, I'm sure, Lib Dem listeners, we will be doing Ed Davey. He has spent most of the week falling into various bodies of water off paddleboards and diving through hoops and
doing a slip and slide.
Yeah, just generally sort of just doing things that will get him noticed in some way. So we are going to come to Lib Dems because actually they are going to be an important part of what happens on July the 4th. For Keir Starmer, this steady as she goes is the way he's clearly going to manage the election campaign. In one space, he's having a bad time, and this is over the whole issue around Diane Abbott and whether she will be able to stand as a Labour candidate. That will need to be sorted out over the next 3 to 4 days. Whenever a party is not in control of the day-to-day agenda, that's a problem for the party, particularly when it's lasting day after day. And we're now in day 3 of that argument. We picked up on this yesterday, which I was pleased about. We got to this early, but it's solidified overnight. What is the relationship between Keir Starmer and his deputy, Angela Rayner? There was no reason for his deputy, Angela Rayner, to say so directly that she could see no problem with Diane Abbott standing for Labour, at the same time as the leader of the Labour Party has said no decision has been made. If Angela Rayner had just stayed quiet, then Labour at the top would not seem to be split. And if Labour is split before an election has happened, when they are supposed to be at their most unified, they are over 20 points ahead still in nearly every single poll. So Rishi Sunak, despite, I agree with you, Camilla, having a better week, has not seen the polls move. If they can't stick to unification through this period, what is it going to be like if they get into government?
The trouble is Angela Rayner can't keep quiet. She's not that kind of politician. I mean, she is his Prescott to a certain extent. There's been a contradiction at the heart of Starmer's positioning this week. I am a socialist, he declares, but I don't want socialists like Diane Abbott in my party. That doesn't quite work. And also this pride in saying, I'm a socialist. I mean, socialists think this is a great idea because it appeals to other socialists. It doesn't appeal to soft Tories. Soft Tories are afraid of the word socialist.
And also, hardly anyone, Camilla, in the UK calls themselves a socialist. Anyways, it's a word that is only used by tribal political people. It's not a word used. No one describes themselves as a socialist. It's not a descriptor that you would use.
But he says this week, "Oh, I'm not tribal Labour." Well, what is he? Because he's sort of not practicing what he's preaching here. Should we talk about TikTok?
Yes, but first of all, as we promised our listeners yesterday, we're going to be wearing tank tops, and then we're going to explain why we're going to be wearing tank tops. You didn't have a tank. You said you didn't have a tank top.
I know,
or
I'm behind the fashion curve.
Or a sweater vest, as I believe they might be called.
So much.
So there's one I brought from home.
Lovely.
There's one here. I'm not sure what this is going to do for our earpieces, but
do you wear that?
I do wear this, Camilla, yeah.
Often?
For people who are listening to this on various podcast platforms, I've got a beautiful rust orange sweater vest, which Camilla is giggling at.
There's one way of describing the colour. Vomit orange could be another way of describing it.
It's slightly sort of Donald Trump face-like, isn't it? It's got that same hue
Trump
to
tan.
it. Okay, so there we
lovely.
are. I'm going to look straight at the camera. Just for our audio guests, audio listeners, I've now put on my tank top, as has Camilla. Camilla's rather more fetching.
Why are we doing this again?
So we're doing this in. So our brilliant socials editor, G-Min, when the Prime Minister came in to the interview on Tuesday, G-Min strode in to do the filming. He does the clips for us. His clips on Rishi Sunak and Star Wars got 1 million views, so amazing work that he does. He came in with a tank top on, and I've just got it again for our YouTube viewers. This is the only picture we have of G-Min. Just to explain that for our audio listeners.
Fabulous. He's just in some kind of like absolutely majestic Burberry style checked tank top.
Beautiful. And there it is for, you can see, I'm just showing it on my laptop there. And in sort of homage to G-Min, who sadly is on a well-earned day off today, a loo day as we call them. We wanted to have a little homage to G-Min and his tank top. And it was the conversation, I think, that most engaged the Prime Minister, although we haven't seen him in a tank top yet on the campaign trail. But I think that would nudge the polls.
There's still time. Shall we talk about the TikTokery of this election? Because when we had David Davis in, he talked about these days elections being fought 80% in the air and 20% on the ground. And what he meant by that was that the days of MPs going around all the doorsteps and putting leaflets through letterbox are over. And actually, you've got to win the air war, which is the war on social media.
Exactly. And I think there are two campaigns going on here. There's what you might describe as more of the mainstream campaign, the stuff we see on television, the stuff we see in more traditional media. And then there's, as you say, the socials campaign. And for most people, that's going to be TikTok, or it's going to be Facebook. And if you remember back to the Brexit campaign, a lot of people pointed out that one of the reasons for the success of the Brexit campaign was how good they were at their socials campaign, particularly on Facebook, being able to define messages that worked for certain demographics and motivated them to come out and vote. Often I find TikTok is sort of seen as an afterthought, a bit of a joke, but it's actually incredibly important, as is Facebook, for the millions of people that it manages to send messages to, who will not be watching the stuff, Camilla, you and I watch all day, every day. So Labour has launched its TikTok campaign channel. It's got 134,000 followers. More importantly, likes, very important part of TikTok. People who view videos and then like them shows an engagement, a positive engagement. The Conservatives, 39,000 followers, only 300,000 likes. But they're both there and they're both playing. So let's just listen to the different style of the TikTok campaign.
I'm looking for a new prime minister. Big plans, good vibes, change lives. Big plans, good vibes, change lives.
That's Labour. And now here's the Conservatives.
Hi TikTok, sorry to be breaking into your usual politics-free feed, but I'm making a big announcement today and I've been told that a lot of you already have some views on it. So, first thing, no, I'm not sending everyone off to join the army. What I am doing is proposing a bold new model of national service.
That was Rishi Sunak there referring to his national service plans.
Down with the kids, as ever.
It does sound a little bit light, fluffy, a bit silly. Those were two that we chose because, you know, you can actually see that tone of TikTok. But actually, it is a way of delivering some things of substance. There are many, many videos on there. Rachel Duffy has joined us. G-Min, as we say, is off on a day in lieu. You're Rachel from our socials team. Lovely. Thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea today. Rachel, tell us why these platforms, let's focus on TikTok in the main. We know that so many people get their first piece of information about anything on their mobile phone on TikTok. Why does this matter for the political parties?
Well, that is the big question, and it's the question that all of the political parties have been wrestling with since 2019. TikTok was in its infancy, and there's been a consistent debate across individual MPs, publishers, and political parties of how we can utilise TikTok to their own advantage. Obviously, in the UK, 23 million users on TikTok every day. There's a huge vote share there to be had, and in what way the different political parties are coming at that, I think, is the most interesting. Kamal, you said earlier that Reform may not be winning the election right now, but they're winning the TikTok battle, as it were, really storming ahead, 1.3 million likes, as you say, you know, more than the Conservatives, more than the Liberal Democrats, only slightly behind Labour. They're really going hard on the Farage line. They're clipping up speeches. They know the viral moments that those politicians are so well known for, and they're really utilising those on TikTok.
One of the reasons, actually, Farage has said to me, I think one of the decisions behind him not standing is that he feels he can reach this audience via socials. So he's got his GB News show. He's also got this extraordinary following on TikTok that he's built up fairly recently. Also, in terms of kind of young people and just plain recognisability, if you're thinking sometimes when people are ticking boxes, they're voting for parties, but they're also voting for personalities. I mean, I was astonished by how much my youngest child knew about Boris Johnson. And I remember speaking to his former head of press, Lee Kane, about one particular viral video, which is the one of Johnson throwing that basketball behind his head and landing a hoop, getting it in the hoop. And of course, Kane was saying, well, yeah, obviously, we weaponised it. It happened years ago. We put it out there because we wanted youngsters to share it. Lo and behold, my son came in and said, have you seen this of Boris? That sort of effect, I think, can't be underestimated. Gone are the days, maybe, of the kind of importance of your Saatchi and Saatchi style poster, Labour isn't working. I mean, these posters are effective, Kamal, but not if they're on a billboard, if they're on social media.
Yeah, and I think it's an and. I think political parties have to do everything. They have to do the billboards, they have to do the traditional campaigning, and they have to do socials. Very similar to you, Camilla. One huge thing that was shared by my kids and many young people was Boris Johnson saying a vegan sausage roll. That became a big deal that he was eating this thing, and you know, and it's those moments that start a journey for voters. I wouldn't want our listeners to kind of think, oh yeah, but it's all just stupid and, you know, skateboarding cats. It's not all they hear about politics, but it starts them. And what was interesting about Boris Johnson was he almost campaigned like he was on TikTok all the time, because he had this warmth, he had this wit, not too polished, not too much detail. And when to so many voters, politics seems so distant, so miles away, I'm already lost by paragraph 2, I've listened to a Keir Starmer speech, goodness me, I can't follow it. Something like the basketball hoop, the vegan sausage roll, whatever it might be.
The rugby tackling of the child.
It just connects me for a moment. I mean, Rachel, how are they navigating these spaces?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point. It's very easy to diminish. And I think TikTok, especially with it being one of those newer social platforms, it's not Twitter, it's not Facebook. It is still relatively in its infancy, despite the growth we've seen. So it's very easy to diminish its impact. But you look at recent polls, 18 to 24-year-olds, 40% of those are getting news from TikTok every day. It's only 20% that are on the BBC. It's a huge outlet for these politicians to use. And I think also the timestamps, for example, the Boris videos, we know that they're from 12 months ago, but on TikTok, you don't know. That might be your first impression of Boris. And I think also the personality politics is really interesting. So Grant Shapps, he's on 300k likes. Not maybe the most well-known minister, but obviously when he's got a whole TikTok around defence, we know that there are huge defence communities on TikTok. It's a very good avenue to really plug those gaps. And I think another thing I'd say on why it's so important, we were speaking earlier about how the first week of campaigning, all eyes on Starmer and Sunak, and then it maybe tones off a little bit and it's picking back up the very end of June, the beginning of July. The thing with TikTok, it's always there and people are using it every day. It's very much part of their daily habits and their routines. They're looking first thing on a morning, maybe on their commute, they're coming home, they're relaxing by it. So I think it's a very unique insight into the demographic, and you're right there with them in their bedrooms, in their bathrooms. You're there all of the time. So the campaign's really able to continue, whereas maybe when the news cycles change, and even here, we're balancing international affairs and domestic politics, whereas TikTok, if you are able to get on the side of the algorithm, people's news feeds can consistently be your party's policies.
It also reveals a little bit about the campaign itself. If you go to each of the TikTok channels for each of the parties, you can see who they put on there. And those are the people they think are their best performers. So on the Labour TikTok is Keir Starmer, of course, as the leader, but also Rachel Reeves, very interestingly, and Wes Streeting, not many other people on there. Rishi Sunak, as you've said, very presidential election. You go to the TikTok for the Conservatives, it is nearly all Rishi Sunak. I think there's a bit of Jeremy Hunt there. So there's some interesting signals there about who they think perform for the voters by looking at their TikTok channels. I'm going to be going into a bit of this in my column. I'm going to be writing over the weekend and it'll be published on Monday, but it's one we're going to keep a tight look on, as tight as our tank tops.
Cozy.